Okay, I'm lucky enough to be here with Dan Shumow from Microsoft Research. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Bill.
Great.
Thanks for
Well,
having me.
yep. Uh, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and what you do at Microsoft Research?
Yeah, so I have worked at Microsoft doing cryptography since the early 2000s. I first started in the Windows crypto team, and then I went to graduate school part time. Then I left Microsoft to go to graduate school in the math department at the University of Washington. And then I left the University of Washington to come to Microsoft Research in 2009. And I have been there on, our team is security and cryptography incubations or security and cryptography. It's the name of our team has changed over the last decade. But there are two main sort of teams at Microsoft Research doing cryptography. There's Kristen Lauder's team, which is more theoretically focused, and then Brian Lamakia's team, which is more of an applied crypto kind of group. Although, of course, you do get a little bit of overlap between those two. It's sort of a spectrum, and we each have a range of that. So I've done a lot of things myself personally on this team. When I started, I worked more on core cryptography libraries. So your asymmetric crypto, I worked with Peter Montgomery doing that. Eventually, we transferred that entirely to the Windows crypto team in uh, around 2015. I don't remember the exact date, but uh, since then I've done uh, it's hard for me to sort of assess a theme to anything that I've done so much as uh, you know try to fill a sort of gap between where you might have engineers working on cryptographic problems and their realm, and then more theoretical or more mathematical aspects of cryptography. I like to try to sort of overlap on either end of those, try to see what problems are occurring actually for uh, cryptographic engineers or practitioners, and apply techniques or take a mathematical understanding of the underlying cryptography and apply it to those sorts of problems.
Yeah, and very much the kind of space that an academic would see, try to bridge the gap between theory and practice. So, what really got you into cryptography?
Well, uh, my my dad told me when I was a kid, I don't know, maybe like 6 or 7, that I came up to him one time and I was like, how do computers, like, I think I'd been playing video games or something. I was like, how do computers do like randomness? How do they make things occur randomly? And so my father is well, he's retired now, but he was an attorney and he had worked at a computer company. I didn't, just as a kid, didn't understand. Not everyone who works at a computer company is an engineer and knows how computers work. Uh, and he was very helpful, and he went to work and talked to some technical people and sort of got an answer that a kid could understand, and he brought it back to me, and he had assumed that I was interested because I had been playing video games. So he gave me the answer, and then he said, why is it that you wanted to know this? Like, what brought this question up? And so apparently what I told him was I had been reading a Calvin and Hobbes comic, and they had made up some code, some secret code for communication. And it was, I mean, I think I've since gone back and seen this comic, and it was some absurd thing like A is Z, B is 18,350, or, just something a little kid would come up with. But I said, yeah, I read this comic, and it got me thinking, like, oh, if you wanted to, you'd really want to do this on a computer, and you'd want to randomize it somehow. So how does a computer sort of randomize things? And my dad was just like, wow, I thought you were wondering how video games worked. And so he says that I always, like, back then I always had an interest in it. I do remember seeing books on it as a kid and thinking it was interesting. And my grandfather had been a cryptographic radio operator in World War II, so that was of some interest. But I didn't really think it was just something I had sort of had a passing interest in. And I read, so Cryptonomicon by Neil Stephenson came out when I was a senior in high school. And I had read that. And prior to that, I thought, like, oh, if you're going to do cryptography, it's something you'd have to be in the military or the government to do. And then I read this book, and I was like, oh, wow, there's a whole, like, career path that's open here. And I think that got me thinking, like, oh, this is something I could do. And then when I was an undergrad, September 11th happened. And so there was a ton of money, scholarships, and things like that for anybody doing anything cybersecurity related or cryptography related. So there was just money, there were job opportunities in it, and it just sort of shunted me in that direction.
That's excellent. And what drives the cryptographic research at Microsoft?
Oh, that's well, Microsoft research, our charter and direction, some might say, is a bit nebulous or potentially unfocused. That's a criticism that I've heard internally, but I think it was set up in that way. There's the famous story of how Bill Gates, like Steve Jobs, was able to take a lot of the technologies that were developed at Xerox PARC and then commercialize them, whereas Xerox hadn't figured out how to use these ideas of like a mouse and a GUI to sell copiers. Excuse me. And so he had set up Microsoft Research as like, okay, that's not going to happen to us. Like, we're going to have this research institute, and it's going to funnel ideas into Microsoft. And that was the idea, but it was also not directed to do only commercially viable things. So from its inception, it was set up with a very wide um, charter. Um, and so I think what you see at Microsoft Research in terms of cryptography reflects that. So, and I think it comes down to the individuals working. We have some people who have a real passion for prototyping things, um, or for moving things to product groups. Um, and then we have some people who are motivated by applying advanced mathematics and uh, um, but I think that speaking for our team, I think what we do is we try to provide um, a place in Microsoft Research and then in the company on a whole where people are looking like 5 to 10 years out, like what is going to be happening 5 to 10 years later. And so, as kind of maybe uninspiring as it is to say,
It certainly isn't. I think as academics, our academic research is moving away from the 3 to 5 year window towards the 5 to 10. Much of the research will probably fail to make an impact, but certainly your work has made large waves in the industry. So you discovered the possible NSA backdoor and the dual EC method. Uh, could you quickly outline what it was, or could you just say what your thoughts were at the time of discovering this?
yeah. So the potential backdoor in the dual EC RNG was there is a a standard put out by NIST, the National Institute of Science and Standards and Technology, sorry, for random number generators. And there was one that had a number theoretic design that used 2 points on an elliptic curve to as a sort of random number generator with supposedly provable security properties where breaking the forward security, backward security of the RNG would be related to solving an instance of the elliptic curve discrete log problem. We were asked at Microsoft. So I did this before I was at Microsoft Research. This was when I was on the Windows team. We were asked by some customers to implement this new algorithm and put it into our cryptographic APIs. And I was working with Niels Ferguson on our team at the time. And so I was taking classes part-time and thinking about going to graduate school full-time in the mathematics department. And so I was digging in a little bit more to the work I was doing. Now, Niels sort of claimed without, in my opinion, adequate mathematical justification that there was a backdoor in this dual EC PRNG. And what had happened was he had been involved or knew people who had been involved in an earlier ANSI discussion of this PRNG and had heard there that there could be a backdoor. And in fact, some people, I forget who exactly, but some people had even patented using this dual EC PRNG as a key, like a key escrow type thing. So I was unaware of that work, and rather my coworker was just claiming to me like, "Oh, there's a backdoor here." So I was like, "This is, provable, whatever. It doesn't have a backdoor." And so what I set out to do was um, recreate the proofs for security of this PRNG to show that there wasn't a backdoor. So, and this was in early 2007. Now there was a crypto 2007. There was a security proof published, like the supposed security proof. So I went through and sort of sketched out the proof, like, oh, this is how you would do it. And then I said, okay, now how do I use this to show that there's no backdoor? And what I found was that, oh, wait, actually, there might be a backdoor. And the reason being that there are 2 points on the elliptic curve. And if you know the discrete log of the second point with respect to the first point, you could get all the subsequent outputs. And so what I had realized is that the assumption I made in my proof was that the points were independently chosen. So when I went back to try to dot my I's and cross my T's, was to say, like, how do my assumptions match the real system? And when I found that they didn't match, that is when I was able to find that problem, the potential backdoor. And then given the sort of rumors of its relationship to the NSA and everything, I thought it was sort of important to let people know, like, hey, maybe you don't want to use this.
Yeah, and you also worked on Shattereds, which proved that you could break SHA-1 generated signatures. What was your thoughts behind that? Because it obviously took you a long time and a lot of computing power to find a collision for a hash signature.
Well, yeah. So I just want to clarify first. I did not work directly on Shattered with Mark Stevenson. I rather worked on a related thing with Mark Stevenson that was detecting SHA-1 collisions when you're doing the when you're actually hashing with SHA-1. So unfortunately, I don't have as much visibility into the actual SHA-1 break. So I'm sorry to kind of disappoint you with that. So I think it would be inappropriate for me to sort of comment on that because I only saw that from the sidelines. Yeah. So.
And we're obviously in a challenging time just now when we're moving away from some of our, or virtually all of our public key encryption, elliptic curve, RSA, discrete logs into a post-quantum crypto world. So NIST has published their round 3 shortlist and we'll soon find what will be the winner. What's your thoughts about where we are just now with Lattice and the other methods?
So, yeah. So it seems that lattices are the preferred solution, given by who is considered a finalist and who is considered an alternate. And I think in a lot of ways that the lattices, well, they're the most sort of like conceptual replacement for asymmetric, for like RSA, just in terms of how they're used and everything. They sort of, if you look at them as a black box, it sort of fits more directly, even though the parameter sizes are different. There's also been a lot of look at lattices in terms of FHE and applied in different places in cryptography. So it's a fairly mature field for this sort of advanced cryptography. So I'm not surprised that it was sort of the front runner. I think that was actually kind of clear all along. I was a little surprised to see this designation of finalist first alternate, and I was hoping to see, if you consider the finalists and the alternates together, I think that you see a real diversity of ideas, which I think is really good. And in some ways, what we would like going forward, I guess, stepping back and looking at just the push for post-quantum cryptography altogether, I have had an interest in quantum computers and quantum computation for almost my entire career. I did a like an honors type project, summer undergraduate research thing when I was an undergrad on quantum computing, before I had sort of focused more on cryptography. And so it's been something I've been interested in for 20 years, or about 20 years, but it's not, and in that time, what I've sort of come to conclude is that it's that large scale, scalable quantum computing is kind of like cold fusion or flying cars, like this like technology that we're not ever really going to fully utilize, but we'll see smaller scale quantum computation, which will be important for quantum chemistry and some sort of simulations. I actually am, I mean, there's an open question on if a smaller sized quantum computer that can't do general purpose quantum computation can be used to break cryptography. But right now, to implement Shor's algorithm or Grover's algorithm in cryptographic settings, it requires more qubits than we can even kind of see. So barring any sort of way that like a small 100-bit, hundreds of like 100 logical qubits could help break crypto systems, which we don't know right now, I don't think we're ever really looking at RSA or discrete log problems being broken by a quantum computer. That said, I do think that looking back at cryptography, in the late 70s, you had RSA proposed. And then that became popular as the internet became popular. Okay, just a few years later in the 80s, you had elliptic curves being proposed. And then in the 90s, the elliptic curves were standardized. You don't start seeing adoption until the early 2000s. And it took, I mean, it was a long, slow, painful slog to get elliptic curves sort of deployed. And so you see this way in which cryptography becomes entrenched. These ideas become entrenched, and I think that the real value in the post-quantum cryptography is that it's providing a push to diversify the solutions that we're using for asymmetric cryptography, and promote this idea of cryptographic agility. So because there's a wider array of parameter sizes or slight subtle differences in how all the different schemes are used, that allows us to figure out how to make our whole stack of cryptography, from the cryptographic primitives up through the higher layers of the stack, the protocols, certificates, and everything, to make them work with this diverse set of algorithms underneath, helps develop cryptographic agility. And if any one of these schemes, like, personally, I believe it's more likely that we'll see some sort of advances in the number field sieve that could, say, get a few hundred more bits of, or, you know, extend the security margins of RSA by a few hundred bits. We're much more likely to see that than we are to see a quantum computer that can break RSA. So if quantum computers are used as this boogeyman to try to push people to diversify the algorithms that we're using, to develop the software better to accommodate different parameter sizes, to, you know, look at how do you do certificates with these different algorithms and everything. It's the pushes in that area, in those areas, where this is really paying dividends for the cryptographic field, practitioners especially.
Yeah, that's great. And your latest paper looks at a nightmare scenario where once every so often a system generates a bad key pair, and where an exception hasn't been caught. And obviously, once you've encrypted something and it's in the wild, you now have the problem that you might have to decrypt. So it could be healthcare records and so on. So I wonder if you could tell us the thought processes that you went through to be able to find a technique to overcome this problem. And maybe if you could explain roughly what the problem was.
Yeah. So the problem was that, what we first saw were reports that there were RSA keys that you could encrypt with but not decrypt with. And when we first heard these reports on our team, we were like, no, what? No, that's, and then we heard more, and then we started looking into it, and we were like, oh, well, you know, we dug down, and then people had been reporting this online. It was in a preview version of the OS, and we had sort of investigated on our own, but a public post sort of explained that what had happened was when you're generating RSA moduli, you start out with the public exponent, which in almost all cases is for the so-called Fermat 4, 2 to the 4 all plus 1. It's a Fermat prime 65537. So you start out with that public exponent, and then you generate your primes P and Q, and you need to make sure that P minus 1 and Q minus 1 are both relatively prime to E. This is almost like a throwaway line. It's like something that when you're learning RSA, you just say, okay, here, you do this. And, sometimes if you dig into it a little bit more, you say, okay, you need to make sure that phi of n, where n is your modulus, is relatively prime to your exponent, so you can calculate your decrypt exponent. Well, that's just the first thing. It's like, why you do it. So what had happened is there was a bug whereby this check was not being done properly. So that every so often RSA keys were generated whereby, because we're using Fermat 4, and that's prime, either E divided P minus 1 or E divided Q minus 1. E is just over 16 bits, so the probability that P or Q is relatively prime, each one it's about 1 and 2 to the 16, so both of them it's 1 and 2 to the 32, 2 to the 15, so or 1 in 32,000 is what I meant. So about that. And so about 1 in 32,000 keys that were being generated with the software with this bug had this property. Now, as I said before, if you go and try to calculate the decrypt exponent, you don't, that will fail. Some cryptographic APIs don't calculate and store the decrypt exponent. Rather, they just store the primes, and you can rederive. So that's sort of what had happened here. And so then we were in the scenario where some plain texts had been encrypted with these bad keys, and users may want to recover their data. So in some ways, if you kind of squint, there's actually a similarity, a mathematical similarity between this problem and the dual EC problem that I had looked at before. Specifically, in the dual EC PRNG, if you know the discrete log of the second point with respect to the first point, what you can do is that some of the bits of the output are truncated off. So you have to iterate and try to find potential next states. So you iterate over the top 16 bits in that algorithm. So you're trying to recover some information that was lost, and you use the curve structure to know which which points to filter out, and that helps reduce the number of possibilities. And then you just look at successive outputs and you very quickly get the right answer. So I think subconsciously, because that's a trick that had worked well for me once in my career, it's something in my sort of toolkit to think about, okay, how do we, if data is lost, are there small subgroups that we have to iterate over to, I guess, to put it another way, I don't shy away from brute force approaches if you're brute forcing over a small set of things. And so what my thinking was like, well, I guess I first had a kind of abstract look at the problem and said, like, okay, well, what is going wrong with the plain texts? The issue is that you have, if your public exponent divides p minus 1 or q minus 1, that means that the multiplicative group mod n is going to have E order elements. So elements that are annihilated by exponentiating with this public exponent. Well, because E is prime, that's going to be a prime group. You know exactly what its size is. It's only E elements. So you don't have that many elements in this group. So right off the bat, like, okay, there isn't that much in an information theoretic sense that's being lost. So you could iterate over that if you needed to. So then, bearing that in mind, I kind of went back and said, okay, so how do I just find what that group is and then, do that? And then it was just, I think, elementary number theory from there on. I don't know. I hope that's...
Yeah, you're correct. I've taught the basics of RSA to students many times, and I breezed over the facts, and I'm sure that many students also understood the method, but didn't see how important it was. And it was really your prompting that says, just in case we didn't catch the exception and we just assume everyone is going to do that, how do we get our keys back? And I tried that, and it worked. Just a simple program, and I could see your method there, and it was really quite wonderful. So in terms of the future, isogenies are seen to be a possible new breakthrough. It would allow us to expand our elliptic curve methods on. Where do you think there is a place for isogenies? Do we need to keep researching them? Are they mature? What do you think the risks might be?
So I did my master's thesis on sort of cataloging at the time what were just computational methods for isogenies, and I implemented William Stein at the time was a professor at University of Washington, and so I implemented that stuff in many of the isogeny algorithms in Sage. So back then, I don't think these public key algorithms had been proposed yet. Isogenies were just a tool. They come up in point counting. They'd been proposed as a potential way of doing a cryptographic PRNG or a hash function. The first meeting for the SHA-3 competition, Kristen Lauder and Dennis Charles had presented a way that they could be used for hash functions, which was interesting to me. And that was like around when I was starting my graduate education, so I had sort of researched that. While I was in graduate school, I did arithmetic number theory, and isogenies come up a lot there. So I had gotten interested in them in that way. And in that sense, I think that they've been well studied in the context of arithmetic geometry. The study is, I think, fairly mature from a mathematical standpoint. Isogenies are a very important structure and tool in the study of elliptic curves and, in general, abelian varieties. But then you always have this gap when you move to doing cryptography because the stakes are higher. It's you're really putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak, when you then use these mathematical objects for security. And so I think what we're seeing in terms of the NIST post-quantum selection process is that the feedback that NIST has kind of rolled up is saying that it's not quite, it's not the most mature sort of technique for building an asymmetric crypto system. And in some point, I think that they're right. You see earlier this year at ANTS, there was the algorithm, the application of the subresultant algorithm for speeding up isogeny computation. So you get a square root speed up, which is quite big. And applying those subresultant techniques in this scenario was new, a very creative idea. I really liked that result. But I think that goes to show that when you're actually talking about the computation with isogenies, there is still a lot of room to grow here, and there's always the risk and danger that the new discoveries from a sort of algorithmic number theory point of view or implementation point of view, that this may lead to new insights which undermine the security. So I guess to kind of, sorry, that was more just sort of musings on the topic, but to roll up what my thoughts are. I personally am very passionate about isogenies as a tool for cryptography. I'm excited about them, but I do think that you see some skepticism of them. It seems to me in some ways sort of like the skepticism that people had for elliptic curves for many years. It's maybe an extension of that, but I do think that they're a good way to develop asymmetric crypto systems, but yeah, it maybe requires a little bit more time in the oven before they're widely accepted. But I do think in the long run we'll see that they are used.
And you said earlier that you worked with the mighty Peter Montgomery, and who really is probably the foundation of much of the elliptic curve that we do now. What was your memories of working with them, and can you remember a specific project that you worked together with?
Yeah. So yeah, Peter. Uh, May his memory be a blessing. Just passed away earlier this year. Um, yeah. So I first met him when I first came uh, to Microsoft. When I was an intern, I was an undergrad intern before I came on full time in 2003. A coworker of mine, uh, Jeff Spellman, who's a long term and early Windows crypto guy, uh, said like, "Oh, hey, you're interested in math. Let me introduce you to this guy who, excuse me, implements our core crypto library." So he introduced me to Peter, and uh, it was interesting to meet him. I learned a little bit about some of his results at that point. And I came back and was working on core crypto, so I worked with Peter just on some of the software he was developing. And I told him, I'm interested in mathematics. I'm interested in going back and getting a graduate degree someday. And so he was very supportive of that. And what he would do is he would work, the AMS has a journal, and they have some challenge type problems in them. So he would bring those by for me and, photocopy them and say, hey, try your hand at some of these. And so I would meet up with him regularly to sort of tell him some ideas. I remember one time I don't remember what the problem was, but I remember that I was able to use Mobius inversion to solve it. And he was like, oh, he was very encouraging. He was like, yeah, that's a good technique to use. Like, they teach you that as an undergrad, like, cool. So we worked on the core crypto libraries together. When I went to graduate school, I actually, for the first year, did not do any sort of teaching, and rather I had a contract where I worked with Peter. And for that contract, we implemented projective coordinates in Peter's crypto library as a speed up for elliptic curve exponentiation. Which prior to that, we had elliptic curve crypto was so unused that people didn't even really care about the slowdown from using affine coordinates. So, whereas even then, projective coordinates were known sort of as the state of the art. So we worked on that together. Worked on a lot of just sort of implementations of arithmetic. He had applied his Montgomery multiplication technique with SIMD instructions, and had sort of come up with unsurprisingly, he had come up with a very good way of using SIMD instructions to implement Montgomery multiplication. And but by then he was sort of not too interested in publishing things anymore. So Greg Zavarucha and I wrote up his algorithm, and we published that. Yeah, in terms of there's a lot of internal stuff that we worked on together. But some of my most salient memories of him are that, well, we did, 90% of the time we spent was working on math stuff. Peter was a very morally and ethically minded person, and he was very passionate about a lot of social justice causes. So I have very fond memories of going to protests against the Iraq War with him. And he would like to go to demonstrations, and he would make signs and bring pots and pans to bang together. He was passionate about public transportation. He himself didn't drive. So it was of a personal benefit to him, but also strongly aligned with his values. So yeah, I have very fond memories of going to stuff like that with him. So
yeah. So obviously the best crypto method in the world can often be broken through side channels, noise, RF, even sound. Do you think designers spend enough time understanding the possible side channels in crypto?
I think that the cryptography field in general spends enough time thinking about this. And I think that there's a real disconnect between what actually ends up getting put into crypto systems, cryptographic libraries. I think in terms of hardware, you see more, but in terms of software, side channels are still pretty hard to pull off. And if you rank the security vulnerabilities that you might have, or problems that you might have, just from a software perspective, side channels still fall pretty low probability, high difficulty, low probability of being exploited. And there is a relatively high cost to putting the implementations in from a software perspective. So when you go and you look at what gets done in actual cryptographic libraries, you don't see a lot of side channel mitigations being put in from from the design perspective. What you see is things that you can demonstrate across a network, like a Blackenbacher style attack, using faults on RSA. You know, you see the mitigations for things like that being put in. From a hardware perspective, you see a lot more being put in, and that's because there's pretty mature tools and techniques, and that's one of the main areas in hardware design when it comes to cryptography. But no, I think this is an area where, in terms of what actually gets used in software libraries, a lot more work could be done in that regard. And I think it's unfortunate that more hasn't been done because there are good understandings of how to do it. But yeah, I don't, it is something I have really thought a lot about. How do you motivate people to put this in from the design, from the get-go? And I don't see any good place to get leverage to motivate that.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and so obviously post-quantum crypto is going to be one of the major horizons. If we maybe looked at this, say, as being 10 years off or so, what do you think the key challenges in cryptography is there within the next 5 to 10 years?
So I have a couple different, I guess, layers of where I think the challenges are going to be. So the first one that I would say is, I think that right now we're currently handling the challenge of instantiating your asymmetric crypto systems. That's what we see in this NIST selection process. And I think that is that we're moving into the end of that, and we're going to have a really good idea how to use these new sorts of problems to build a cryptographic primitive. 5 to 10 years off, I think we are still 5 to 10 years. If we're lucky, we're going to be looking at how to get these into actual software systems. A lot of work on standards for adding post-quantum cryptography there. A lot of work of deploying certificate infrastructures that can handle this, handle this new cryptography, deploying protocols. So I think that from a sort of industry perspective, that's where we're going to see the most the most sort of push and the most challenges. Then I think in terms of what we're going to see in cryptography, I don't remember who said this, but at crypto in 2019, I was speaking with Nadia Henninger, and we were talking about uh, post quantum crypto, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, all I think about when I uh, see this post quantum crypto is like, oh, this is the thing that Nadia is going to be tearing apart in 10 years." um,
Okay, and obviously there are opportunities within cryptography for new businesses, startups, and so on. If you could give advice to a startup company who wanted to get into this area, what area do you think would be the best to challenge?
so yeah, so I'm not a very startup minded person. So I don't think a lot about like what a good startup would be, or what startups should do. But I do think there are sort of interesting areas for development in the field of cryptography. Um, the obvious answer is all the cryptocurrency and blockchain stuff. And there is a sort of attitude where people look down on that in the cryptography community at a whole. Uh, and admittedly, a lot of cryptocurrencies and um, those sorts of solutions do not do or do not really extend in a terribly interesting way what we've done in the cryptographic field. But that said, I'm reminded, this is going to be a weird sort of aside, but bear with me because it really is how I think about this. Right when I was out of college, like at the end of college, and when I was starting at Microsoft, the artist, MIA, she's from London, born in Sri Lanka and went to London, and she's now like a big pop superstar. Her first songs came out on the internet, and I heard them and liked them, and I mean, this is just like what people my age were listening to. And I really liked it. And then I went to Microsoft, and some of the older guys who weren't that old, I mean, I was in my early 20s and they were maybe in their mid 30s. They were like, I heard this woman, MIA, on the radio, and I'm like, this isn't even music. This is just a bunch of sounds. And they were really like ripping into this new music and this new style of whatever. And what they didn't hear was that whether or not you like this musical artist, she was doing interesting things and she was providing a sort of more international perspective in the music she was doing. So it was resounding with me as a young person at that time for those reasons. And they just didn't see it or hear it. And so I'm not terribly interested in cryptocurrencies and in blockchain and in working in those areas. But I don't want to be like those guys who, when I was young, were like dissing the music that I was listening to because they didn't get it. And I do talk to young people coming up and getting into the crypto world through cryptocurrencies and everything. And they're doing interesting things, and they are using interesting things uh, from the field of cryptography. So I don't particularly personally like that space very much, but I also feel like they're doing some interesting things, especially around uh, anonymizing, and all the different ways you can sort of make progress. They're also really good at doing little tricks with the cryptography, which, you know, I think that at a high level, I guess what I would say is I think cryptography is pretty saturated. I work with Josh Benelo, and he wistfully speaks of the days in the 80s when there was just tall grass as far as the eye could see in the field of cryptography. And we're just not there anymore. That's not where the field is. And so I think that in the cryptocurrency and blockchain space, some of the younger people coming in and doing that they're staking out their own area with tall grass. And even though it's not as related to what we've done in the larger cryptography field, I think that there's interesting stuff to be done there. And yeah, I know that's a sort of high level and not very specific, but that's the direction I would point people to.
I suppose Microsoft is a very unusual company because it's managed to sustain itself from its days of DOS and horrible old PCs and so on. So I think there's a lot to learn from Microsoft in the way that it's changed and evolved. Many other tech companies have come and gone. So what are you working on now, or what's your next big research project?
Well, the main thing that I'm looking at now is the larger quantum space, not necessarily post-quantum cryptography, but quantum random number generators, QKD, and other ways that maybe small scale quantum computers can be used. So just like at a high level, that's kind of the direction that I'm sort of like putting effort towards. I have some other sort of smaller research projects, but those are just kind of a hodgepodge of things. But yeah, the main direction and push is in that regard. Microsoft is a very big company, and so there's a lot of different things that we do. So that provides a lot of interesting opportunities and insights into different areas in the industry, in the larger high-tech industry. So hopefully trying to find places where these new quantum technologies can be applied. I wish I had more to say on that right now, but I think that direction is pretty new, so I don't have a lot of results, so to speak, yet.
Yeah. And finally, if you weren't doing cryptography, what do you think you'd be doing?
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I guess I have two uh, two sort of differing directions with that. Uh, Realistically speaking, if I could do it all over again, I think I probably would still end up in the high tech industry. It's just this sort of forces um, at the age that I was. It's just kind of the was who was sort of hiring and where there was money and opportunities. Um, so in that regard, more than cryptography, I do like this sort of uh, the sort of aspect of taking advanced mathematics and applying it to like real world problems. So graphics are something that I um, might be interested in. If I was a little bit younger, I think machine learning,
Yeah.
or maybe that as as well. Quantum computers. I also uh, did some work on that as an undergrad, and that also has this pattern of advanced mathematics applied to real world problems. So in that sense, I think that's sort of what I would be doing if I worked in the sort of tech industry. But the other thing I guess I would say is that so I volunteer with an organization here in Seattle. It's an educational not for profit where I work with students. We do homework help, um, but it's a interesting setup because it's fairly free form. It's kind of like a study hall where we provide help to um, students, and it's available on a first come first serve basis, and it's free for any students who want to come. But the setup of how we have it set up, is that it attracts very motivated students, and most of our students are East African children of East African immigrants, and they're a very motivated demographic, uh, and come from a culture with a strong emphasis on education. So they're really great students to work with. And I do a lot of math education there. And I have a lot of teachers in my family, so I enjoy teaching. I think education is extremely noble profession, especially younger kids. I mean, obviously there's the college level. So uh, that is something that I personally am very passionate about. It is hard in America right now with the way the economy is to support a family, especially in Seattle, as solely as an educator. So um, it's hard for me to imagine, or solely as a elementary school sort of like, or elementary, middle, or high school educator. So it's hard to imagine that being a total career, but uh, I very easily get as much satisfaction from working with those kids as I do from doing the cryptography. So I often think like, oh, if I couldn't do this or if I couldn't work in high tech, I would very very happily work in that sort of that manner of education. So
Good for you. And it's so true. Education really is one of the most fundamental building blocks that we have in our lives and can change people's lives. And I think it's important that we understand that your education never finishes, especially in cryptography. And one of the
yeah,
reasons I love it is that I'm forever learning. And sometimes I feel as if I've just scratched the surface. And one day I pick up a research paper and I have a completely different viewpoint on things. So thanks very much, Dan, for the interview,
thank you.
and hopefully enjoy the rest of your day in Seattle. So thank you very much from sunny Edinburgh, and hopefully I'll speak to you soon. Thank you.
Sounds
Goodbye.
good. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. Very good talking to you.
Bye-bye.